Hey guys, I've got a really interesting game to share with you today. This was from a challenge that just popped up this morning, and it's a 45 minutes, 45 plus 45, I think. Yeah, 45 plus 15 game. And my opponent's rated just under 1100, and it's a really, really awesome game, and there's loads and loads to learn from this. So let's just dive in and I'll take you through it. Both of us played in the 80s in accuracy, so pretty decent result, really. Anyway, so we have e4 and d6. So this is pretty quiet. This is the Pirc's defense. Obviously, one issue with this is that this light squared bishop may have issues coming out into the board. There's an option of fianchetto maybe there. But right now, there's now 2 pawns in front of the dark squared bishop. So obviously I grabbed the center with d4, and we have knight to f6. So this could be signaling this setup and castle kingside. Now I play knight to c3 because obviously there's a knight attacking this pawn. The pawn is currently undefended, so develop and do what you need to do. So I need to defend the pawn. I think pushing at this point is not an option, because if pawn takes, you've got queen takes d1, then king takes, and I've lost castling rights, okay? It's not something I want to happen. Now my opponent plays d7, again, kind of solid, but again, now we have 2 bishops with no prospects to develop right now, so definitely on the slow side. I now develop my bishop to c4, eyeing up the f7 square, and also removing one of my kingside minor pieces, getting ready to castle. And we have e5. Now, a lot of beginners will go, oh, there's tension in the board. One of these pawns is going to have to capture the other pawn. Well, the more higher level games that you watch, the more you will notice that stronger players tend to be more comfortable with allowing tension to be there on the board, okay? Particularly when both of them feel like, well, there's no real advantage in them, or to them, in making the exchange. So here, if I take black takes, or even worse, if I take knight takes, that's just really improving this knight. There's nothing really in that for me. Likewise, if black takes, I can recapture with a queen. It's just free development either way. So we leave the tension be. So I develop knight to f3. I'm now getting ready to castle. We have bishop e7. I think maybe the fianchetto option, this King's Indian structure, may have been okay at this point. And I develop my final bishop now to e3, just putting a third defender on this pawn here. And I'm just kind of holding off, because my opponent hasn't really signaled that he's going to castle either way. I would expect him probably to go kingside, because he's still got a problem with developing this bishop here, and also the queen's got to move as well. But so I haven't yet decided which way I want to put my king. So I think developing my bishop, I'm just getting all my my pieces out to the front line. Now I play a quiet h3. Again, I'm just holding off. One of the questions that I get quite often in the comments on my videos is, could I do a video on which side to castle? And it's quite a tough topic to cover, really. I mean, we'd have to go over a bunch of different games, because which side you castle on depends on a number of factors. It depends on, for example, where are your opponent's pieces, particularly where are their bishops, where's their queen. If the bishops are kind of lined up on this side of the board, then maybe you don't want your king down there. Likewise, if the bishops are over here, maybe you don't want your king down there, because they're x-raying through to your king, which is the piece that you have to protect for the first part of the game, or even the whole game. Another option could be, for example, how advanced are their pawns? So, if your opponent's got quite advanced pawns on one side of the board, and you castle to that side, then they have a head start in maybe storming your king with pawns. Lots and lots of considerations, but we'll try and address that, I think, in this video. Now we have queen to c7. And I think you will see as the game goes on that this move did not work out too well for black, because this queen now is committing to this side of the board, but then she's behind a couple of dark squared pawns. If this pawn pushes, we could have d5, and we have kind of a gridlock here. And how much scope is this queen going to have? As the queen's obviously the most powerful piece on the board, and is therefore a very important attacking piece, can also be a very important defensive piece. I now push my queen to d2. Again, I haven't yet committed which side I want to castle, and I'm thinking maybe I might, I might castle long and try and get both of my both of my rooks here, and maybe do a pawn storm if my opponent goes kingside, for example. And now we have h3, so this is simply preventing my knight and bishop from coming into this square. I mean, with the bishop looking at f7, remember I placed that there earlier on, knight into here could be a distinct threat. Okay, so now I decide to castle. Okay, move 9, I've now completed development, because I've thrown in an extra pawn move here. So on move 9, and I decide to go long. This bishop is going to be no threat to my king here anytime soon. This bishop in that position is looking at the sides of the board, so that's no threat. The knights are holding back very much, and it feels like they're not really about to jump in and threaten my king. So I kind of feel okay here. Right? My bishop is already looking down at this side. This bishop is now looking at the pawn on h6. I've got some space to move my pawns into quite happily here. And I'm thinking I'll move my rook across and start an attack down that side. And now black commits. Now black castles kingside, which is exactly what I want. So rook d to g1. And I am simply thinking, okay, now we're in the middle game. I've completed development. Black still has a problem with one bishop. And also I might argue that the queen is not in a fantastic position. Neither is this knight really. And so without any further ado, you should start with your preparations for engaging in battle. You'll notice that as things stand, there's been no material captured so far. And now rook to d8. Again, I think this is possibly questionable. One thing is, it is giving the king some maneuverability, but I think there are probably preferable approaches here, So if you look at it from black's perspective, right? Let's just flip the board, right? From black's perspective, white has just played rook d to g1. So why did your opponent play that move? Well, there's lots of possibilities. I mean, one thing to look out for could be a bishop sack on h6, and pawn takes, and queen takes, and suddenly you've got a queen here in your face. You could have knight coming in here, queen there, potentially if this knight should ever move. Lots of checkmating ideas, okay? So at this point in time, maybe castling that side wasn't too wise. I don't know. But you do need to pay attention not just to what your opponent just did, but what is my opponent thinking of doing in the next few moves. Okay, so we'll switch back over. So rook d8, and now if you look on the side of the board that the king is on, there are only 2 pieces. Okay, on the queen side we have 5 pieces, and is that important, right? Conversely, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces on the same side as my king, and I've got 3 pieces on the opposite side. So now I start g4. No point hanging around at this point in time. I'm ready to start. I've completed development. I've lined up both rooks against black's king. My bishops are pretty well placed. I've got a defensive knight that's guarding this, and I've got another knight that's ready to jump in and join in the fray. So black here played knight back to f8. Maybe that's the reason for moving the rook across, I don't know. But knight to here, and so it's good to see that black is thinking, hang on, maybe I need some more bodyguard around the king. And now g5. I'm quite happy. If you want to trade, I can take back with bishop, knight, or even rook. Rook would probably be preferable actually at this point, because with rook, if rook takes, I can move my rook h to g1 and potentially start a barrage on there. But I decide here to capture with the bishop. One good thing about this is now I have bishop h6, which means that I'm really threatening this pawn. I could threaten with bishop and then, so bishop's here, I could capture that pawn and then move away with the discovery, maybe with material. But more than anything else, I just want to bust open this king side. So black now plays decent move. So this knight has now come on a bit of a journey from there to there and now to here. Okay, so this is a fairly standard pattern, bringing in both knights in the defense of the king. So I would say it's pretty well played by black. And now h4. So I'm simply aiming to push up, dislodge this knight. Knight can't take because rook takes. And the bishop now comes into g4. And I decide to capture the primary defensive knight. So this knight guards these two squares. And my h-pawn would like to make progress up there at the h file if possible. So, okay, this is really interesting actually. Okay, so I capture the knight, bishop captures the knight. So now we have options, right? Material is equal. First blood has been drawn. I have a bishop that's looking at a bishop, but black has a bishop looking at my rook. Okay, so how do you resolve this situation? We've traded a piece each, but I have a higher value piece now under attack. So I simply play rook to h3, okay? And now black's looking at my bishop, but now I'm looking at black's bishop. Plus I've developed my rook to an extent. I've got it off the back rank, it's ready to double up maybe with its buddy. We have bishop takes, rook takes bishop. And now pawn takes, because he's got two attackers now on there, so well spotted. And now I decide to sack my rook for that bishop, right? This forces g to recapture. And what that means also now is that this knight is pinned. Okay, so I'm feeling like, yeah, I've got, I'm now down in material. I've got a knight under attack here, right? But my objective, my strategic objective in this game is to force the h-pawn through, maybe get my queen in, use my rook here, and take advantage of the fact that these pieces, particularly that queen, are not really involved at this point, right? So I think, again, we're seeing the downside of this queen move, locking the queen in a very kind of defensive position, but defending what? What's she defending? She's defending pawns on the opposite side of the board to where the king is. Right? So I would say that is not the best way to employ the queen. Okay, so pawn recaptures, and now queen captures the pawn that's attacking my knight, and now we're looking at this pawn as well. So black plays the king across, breaking the pin on the knight. The knight could now be free to capture on h4. So I dive in with the queen, grab the pawn. So now white is just up really one pawn. White has one extra pawn, but I'm down the exchange because I have a bishop for a rook. Okay, but the defense around the king side is starting to look very thin. Okay, now we have knight to e5, so that's now attacking my bishop here. And I simply play queen to g7. Right, so this is very forcing. The king's going to have to move to either e7 or e8. King moves to e8. And now I just drop my bishop back to b3. It's just very sensible. It's defended twice there. It's also defending now both of these pawns. And my queen and my rook are now able to come in, join the attack. So king to d7. This king clearly wants to run away and find some shelter. So I now play f4. This is a good time for a pawn break. I want to dislodge this knight. This knight is doing a good job. It's defended by a pawn there, but more importantly, it's protecting this pawn on f7. Because I would love to grab that pawn. Okay, so I want to kick the knight away. And this is a lovely move. Really good move by black. Pinning the queen. It's actually a skewer on the queen. So the queen can't capture here because knight takes. And if the queen moves anywhere else, got rook takes, rook with check, and it's suddenly looking very good for black. So we have an exchange. I swap off my queen for both of black's rooks. Now numerically, that's actually slightly better for white. A queen is nominally worth 9 points, rooks are worth 5 points each, so you would say that on paper we are now equal in terms of material, and that's what the board is telling us. We've got the same amount of material on the board. I've got a rook for black's queen, we both have a knight, I have this extra bishop. Alright, so game on. Knight moves now to g6. Maybe the idea is to try and trap this rook. Rook can't go there, it's covered by the knight. Can't go there, it's covered by the king. Can't go there, it's covered by the knight. But this knight should be fairly easy to dislodge, so I now push Harry, the h-pawn. I want to get rid of that knight. I'm actually offering up this pawn because, in fact, the knight here is forking 2 pawns. But now, h5, h6, h7, h8 is a serious threat. And my rook's on the back rank. So how is this queen that is currently stuck and in storage on c7, how is that queen going to guard this square? How is black going to stop me from promoting on that square using really just the knight? I mean, the queen can't wriggle round. Where can the queen go? I mean, we've got maybe 1, 2, something like that, but the promotion square is still guarded by my rook as well. Okay, so if we had like queen here, push, queen here, push again, I don't know. It's not looking great. I can even push a pawn, block the queen's defense. Definitely option. So knight now grabs the pawn, and I push h6. Keep the pressure on. Okay. Now at every point in a game, you should at least have a plan, an idea. How can I win this game? And right now, material is equal. So my plan to win this game is to promote the h-pawn. Simple as that. Okay? And sometimes, very often, the simplest plans are the best. You just need to spot what is your best prospect at each point in a game. And I'm really taking advantage of this bad queen. Okay, so the knight now comes back, so the knight has to guard the h8 square. So one option is I could just push forward, promote, knight has to give up its life to capture the queen, and then I'm playing with a rook, a knight and a bishop against the queen. And that ought to be pretty good. So now I dive in, grab this spare pawn, right? It's completely undefended. I'm also now hitting the knight a second time, okay, because I've just removed the defender of the knight, and the knight now moves back to e5. So the knight's now attacking the bishop. So rook to g7, and now the knight can't capture the bishop because rook takes, skewering the king. King has to move, and then I would win the queen and win the game. So that's not an option. Now the queen starts to come around, and this, I think, was a really key moment. It's very tempting in times like this to rush your moves and think, okay, I'm gonna blitz out h7. Okay. However, you have to be very aware. And I'm thinking, okay, what is my opponent's intention with this move? Well, queen g1 isn't an option because the rook can capture. Okay. However, black does have another check here, and it would be queen e3. Okay. So right now, queen e3 would be a problem because my king would have to move to one of these squares, and then the queen could come in and capture my favourite pawn. And I don't want that to happen. So I need a way to resolve this, okay? Queen e3 is a threat. Now, when I look at the board, I figure, well, this knight isn't doing an awful lot right now. It's guarding this pawn, but that pawn's not under attack. So knight to d1 simply guards that square. So now black doesn't have a good check. All right? Queen goes there, knight takes queen. And queen goes there, rook takes queen. So there's no decent check now on the board for black. So the queen now comes into d4. And this, I think, was really smart. My opponent thought for a minute and a half over this. And I think for nearly a minute over my next move. But I missed the tactic. Now let's see if you can spot the tactic that black has just very, very skillfully prepared. And I think for somebody under 1100, this is a really, really smart approach. And again, we're talking tactics. The tactics is all about pattern recognition. Okay, so what are the patterns and the shapes on the board here that could give black a significant advantage? Right? Now, let's say if I just play h7 now, which is in fact my next move. Okay, I play h7, which I think was a blunder. Because now black has the option to win material. And it's pretty straightforward, okay? Now that was a bad move. What I should have done is actually move my king maybe to, no, that wouldn't have worked, because then I'd have had a simple checkmate on the back rank. But pushing this pawn was a mistake, and here's why. Because the next move, and I saw, as soon as I played my move, I saw black's move. I saw the tactic, right? And the tactic is this: knight to d3, check. Okay? Check is the ultimate forcing move. When you're in check by a knight, you either have to move the king away and out of check, or you have to capture the knight. There's no other options. You can't interpose a piece, so I'm pretty much forced now to capture the knight with my c-pawn. And now queen takes rook. Okay? And suddenly I've got a bishop and a knight against my opponent's queen. However, chess is all about imbalances. There are multiple imbalances going on, okay? So, the queen is forking my bishop and my pawn. Now, there's a very, very important pattern, and a very, very common pattern that every player must know, particularly in endgames, which is how a bishop and a pawn can protect each other, okay? Bishop g8. The bishop is now defending the pawn, but more importantly, the pawn is now defending the bishop. Okay, so these pieces are now locked in an embrace. Okay, and this queen now has to guard the h8 square for eternity. The queen moves anywhere else, as long as it's not with check. Right, so queen to there, I get a queen. So the queen pretty much has to stay on this diagonal, or has to stay on the h-file, okay, in order to capture should this pawn ever promote on h8. Okay, so very, very important move there. Now the king moves across. So what's the king trying to do? I don't know really, because the king can't actually play a part in this. So is the idea to go there, queen takes, I don't know, but then, you know, black's going to end up being a knight down in that instance. So I'm not quite sure what the plan is with the king there. So now I start to bring my knight in. Obviously, there's a very attractive option here of knight to f5 with a royal fork on king and queen. That would win. The queen's not having that, and I thought, haha, you, Wally, right? You've spent nearly 3 minutes thinking about this move, and you've moved your queen, maybe to avoid this fork, but you've moved it onto another square where it can be forked, and I tried to play this. No, that doesn't work. Why? Because the knight is pinned by the queen. I cannot play that move. So the queen's on the h-file, okay? So it's guarding h8. It's a really, really clever move. So I move my king, king c2. Now the king moves in again. Still, I'm not quite sure what this king's idea is. And now I can play my knight into f5. And this comes with a fork. I'm looking at the queen and also this pawn on d6. Okay, so now the queen moves away. Again, it still has to guard h8. Now I grab the pawn. And we have king g7. And now I come back in with check. And now the king sticks itself on h8. That was the idea. The king just wants to block up the h8 square. Okay, now, you are white. How can you possibly win in this situation? We are slightly down in material. Okay, we're actually 2 pawns up. And we've got 2 minor pieces for a queen. Okay, so numerically it's pretty close. But how on earth can white win this game? Well, what I figure is the only option is somehow to get my knight to this square on f7. This is the key square, right? If my knight gets onto f7, the king's in check and has to move. That's forced. And then I can play pawn to h8 equals queen. Queen will have to trade off. Well, in fact, so let's see. If knight's there, king has to move away. The pawn doesn't have to promote immediately, but yeah, that's it. With my knight on there, queen has to trade. Knight takes queen. Okay, and even if the king takes the bishop, I should still be okay. I've still got a 1 pawn advantage. I've got a nice passed pawn on e4. Okay, so I now play b4. There was a reason for this. Yeah, I'm guessing that if my knight wants to move to here, I just want to avoid this check by the queen. Okay? Because that, like if I just did something else, just ordinary, right? Then I put my knight here, then black has queen c5 with check and a fork on the knight. So that would lose the game. Okay? So I need to cover that. Now we have a check with a queen. Now So the queen now no longer has to stay on the h-file because the king has shoved itself in the way of the promoting pawn. So I play king b3 anyway. We have queen across the d2, now looking at this pawn, and I play king to here. Queen takes the a pawn, and I move my king across. We have another check, king c4. We have another check, king d4. Okay, and now b5 is played. That gives me a little bit of breathing space. The checks have stopped. Okay. Now my opponent at this point has sent me a message later on, because we're friends on chess.com, saying maybe I should have just kept the checks coming and gone for a draw by repetition, which is arguable at this point in time. But I don't know. And I still have a bishop and a knight on the board. There are opportunities to block. And maybe I could have even cracked up with the e-pawn as well, but we'll see. So another check, king to here. Now what checks does black have? Right? Can't go there or there, because king simply captures. Can't go here because the king captures. So you might say now that we are out of checks. So the queen captures on b4, right? But that is now fairly catastrophic, because now I can play the critical move, knight to f7, check. There's only one move available for black, and now I get a queen. So the queen's defending this bishop, the bishop's defending the knight, and the knight's defending the queen, and it's all going to be over pretty soon. So we have another check, have another check, have another check, and now I'm thinking that I don't want to get into a situation with a 50 move draw, or I keep dancing around until the clock goes down. So a couple more and I play my queen now to d4. I figure I'm going to force the exchange of queens. And this is a really good way to do it. You give check and attack the queen at the same time. You pretty much compel your opponent to trade queens. Okay. Now this does drop the bishop, but my opponent here chooses not to capture the bishop. He figures instead that dashing down the queen side with these pawns is his best chance. I'm not sure about that, but I think it's a losing position anyway. I now move my knight away, and the king does finally grab the bishop. Now I can grab one of his 3 pawns. Now my king actually should probably be able to handle these pawns on its own, but I've got a spare knight, And black now pushes a3, and now knight to b4 blocks this pawn's advance, and should this pawn ever move forward, knight simply takes, and if this pawn ever moves forward, knight captures there. So my knight has got these 2 pawns handled. That's absolutely fine. Okay, so now the king comes back in. I centralize my king. Okay, it's like a bullfight now. King to there, push a pawn, and just gently, now I grab the pawn. Okay, and check. Now pawn to here. Critical move. Now, if I had, this is really important to remember, this pattern, if I'd moved my king to e6 at this point, okay, and the pawn pushes, I cannot capture the pawn. Why? Because black would be in stalemate. If my king is on e6, the pawn's guarding those 2, the king's guarding those 2, stalemate, and it's a draw. Okay, so I twigged this. So I said, rather than risk the draw, because right now the king has a square. Okay, so instead of risking that, I play knight to b4, and that stops the option of the pawn push, right? And therefore, the only move that's now available to the king is this move. So the king now has to move. I play king d7, and my opponent resigns at this point because there's no way of stopping the e-pawn from promoting. Okay, so I just think there's some really, really good tactical patterns in there. Some very nice moves by my opponent as well, particularly setting up that apparent knight sacrifice, putting my king in check to win the rook. I think that was a really, really sweet move. Definitely looking at some talent here. And yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. I think there's tons of interesting tactical ideas in this particular game, so had to be shared. Hope you've got some value from it. Thank you for watching my videos. I really, really do appreciate it. Please like, please comment, please share, please subscribe to Chess Bootcamp if you aren't already a subscriber. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you soon.